Welcome to the Thinking Out Loud podcast show. In this episode, we will be discussing Part 1, Project 2025.
All right, let's dive into something pretty massive. It's called Project 2025.
Oh yeah, this one.
Yeah. So, imagine like a 920-page to-do list for like the whole U.S. government.
That's a lot of pages.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
And that's basically what this is. And it's this blueprint that comes from the Heritage Foundation.
Right.
Which listeners will probably know is a conservative think tank. And they've outlined kind of their vision for if there's an administration change in 2025.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's so unusual to see such a, ready-to-go plan like this.
Yeah, super detailed.
Super detailed, and it really, just kind of shows how prepared they are.
Yeah.
How serious they are about this.
So I want everyone listening to just picture this, okay? You suddenly get handed the keys to this, like, giant complex machine, which is the government.
Right.
And this document is like someone's instruction manual on how they would want things to run.
Exactly.
So let's just, like, unpack a little bit. What are the 4 main objectives that they lay out?
Well, first, they aim to shrink the size and the scope of the federal government significantly.
Like a lot.
Like a lot.
Okay.
Second, they propose restructuring some key agencies, which of course has some pretty big implications.
Yeah.
Then, they advocate for these sweeping policy changes.
Across a lot of different sectors.
Across all different sectors.
Okay.
And then lastly, and maybe most strikingly, they actually talk about replacing career bureaucrats with people who are aligned with their conservative principles.
Okay, so that last part for sure is going to raise some eyebrows, so let's get into some specifics here.
Yeah.
They're talking about potentially eliminating entire departments.
Wow.
Like the Department of Education, can you even imagine?
It's hard to wrap your head around it.
Like, what would that even look like?
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there.
No.
They're talking about slashing staff at agencies like the EPA.
Right, and to understand this, we have to consider their ideology.
Okay.
The report uses this phrase, root out the managerial left.
Oh, wow.
When they discuss the federal bureaucracy. So it suggests that they just have this deep skepticism about how the system's working now.
Like it's fundamentally flawed.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
And that, it's dominated by a certain way of thinking.
So they're not just aiming for a change in policy, they want to change the people.
Yeah, the people who are actually making the decisions.
Who are making the decisions. All right.
Yeah.
So then what about the economic side of things? Because they're proposing tax cuts,
Yes.
deregulation, and scaling back welfare programs, like a lot.
A lot, yeah. And this is very much in line with the broader conservative economic philosophy, emphasizing limited government.
Less government.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
But we have to think about, how volatile that could be.
Yeah, well, what does that actually look like?
I mean, they're talking about cutting potentially 50,000 federal jobs.
50,000? That's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so, while tax cuts might sound really nice,
Appealing,
there's always this question of trade-offs. They mentioned redirecting funds.
Right.
But what does that mean for, people who rely on those programs?
Yeah, like what are they going to cut?
Exactly.
Okay.
And critics would argue that such drastic changes could lead to some pretty unintended consequences.
Like what?
Like unemployment going up.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe gaps in essential social services.
Right.
These are debates that we're seeing right now.
All the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
And this kind of throws it into sharp relief.
Yeah, it's like this plan could really shake things up, it seems like.
Definitely.
But how does this actually, translate to real-life impacts for people listening?
Right.
So let's shift gears a little and look at some specific examples.
Okay, yeah, let's zoom in on a few key areas.
Okay.
So imagine the Department of Education just gone.
Poof.
What does that mean for, students and teachers?
Yeah.
All over the country.
Families.
Families, yeah.
Right. And think about the EPA.
Oh, huge.
They're proposing a major reduction in their regulatory power. Now, I could see how, some businesses might like that.
Sure.
But then what about clean air and water?
Exactly. That's the question.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge.
And then healthcare.
Oh, healthcare is another big one.
Right. There are a lot of changes that are being proposed there.
Potentially limiting certain types of healthcare access.
Which could affect millions of people.
Millions of Americans, for sure.
And then we can't forget about the Department of Justice.
Right.
Because they're proposing changes that could affect civil rights enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a big one.
That raises some really important questions about fairness
Big time.
and equality in our society.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway here is that changes to one agency
Right.
could just have this domino effect
Absolutely.
and impact like all these different areas.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah, okay, so we've laid out some pretty big potential changes.
Yeah.
But of course, this all hinges on one thing, the 2024 election.
That's right. We have to remember that this is like a blueprint.
Right. It's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
So whether it becomes reality really depends on what happens next year.
So it's almost like we're looking into like a potential future.
The possible future, yeah.
One that could have huge implications for everyone.
For everyone listening, for sure.
And I think it's one that's worth understanding, even if you don't agree with it.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power.
So let's take a deeper dive
Okay.
into some of these specific agencies and proposals
Right.
and how they could affect you.
Good.
Listening.
Let's do it.
So think about the areas of government that affect you the most
Yeah.
and get ready to explore what could happen with Project 2025,
The ripple effects.
the ripple effects.
Yeah.
All right, we'll be right back.
Let's start with the Department of Education, since that's what we were just talking about.
Okay.
Project 2025 proposes eliminating potentially federal student loan programs.
Whoa, okay.
Think about what a huge change that would be for anyone with student debt.
Right, or planning to go to college. Or planning for higher education.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a monumental shift.
it would totally reshape how we think about college, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And we have to consider the ripple effect on the economy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Fewer people might go to college because of the cost.
Right.
And that could impact the workforce.
Yeah. Less innovation.
Exactly. It really highlights how interconnected all these systems are.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk about something that affects pretty much everyone, the EPA.
Yeah, the EPA.
They're proposing a big reduction in their power.
Yeah, their regulatory power.
Now, like I said, some businesses might be happy about that,
Sure, less red tape.
but what are the downsides?
That's where the trade-offs come in.
Okay.
Less regulation could mean faster economic growth in some industries,
Right.
but it also raises concerns about the environment.
Like what?
We could see a rollback of environmental regulations.
Like the ones we already have.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that could lead to more pollution, maybe even health risks.
And these debates are already happening. Like,
Oh, absolutely. Every time you turn on the news, it's climate change this, environmental concern,
it
that
feels like it's every day.
it's constant. And Project 2025 really brings these issues to the forefront.
Like it forces us to think about them.
Exactly. It forces us to confront the potential consequences.
About choosing deregulation over protection.
Yes. What are we willing to sacrifice for economic gain? What are the long-term implications for our planet?
These are big questions.
Huge questions.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is.
And it makes you think about what's really important.
What are our values?
Okay, let's move on to healthcare, because that's obviously a big one.
Healthcare is huge.
What are some of the key proposals about healthcare access in Project 2025?
One of the main ones is to shift away from the Affordable Care Act.
Okay, so like Obamacare.
Right. And move towards a more market-driven system.
More like a free market,
Exactly. They also propose restructuring Medicare and Medicaid.
which are like lifelines for a lot of people.
Millions of Americans rely on those programs, especially seniors and low-income individuals.
And those programs are already under a lot of pressure, right?
They are. There are already a lot of debates about their sustainability and effectiveness.
So any changes there could have a massive impact.
Absolutely. And critics argue that these changes could actually make healthcare more expensive.
For individuals and families.
Yeah, they say it could lead to fewer coverage options and potentially even more uninsured Americans.
Wow, that's a lot to take in.
It is, and it's not just about the cost.
It's about people's lives.
Exactly. These changes could impact people's health and their access to essential care.
Okay, last agency I want to touch on is the Department of Justice.
Okay, the DOJ.
What kind of changes are we looking at there?
Project 2025 advocates for a shift in priorities at the DOJ.
Like what?
They want to reduce federal prosecutions for certain types of crimes,
Like which ones?
particularly drug offenses.
Okay.
And they also want to scale back on civil rights enforcement.
That's a pretty big shift.
It is, and it's a controversial one.
What are the potential consequences of that?
Well, supporters of this approach would argue that it reduces the size and scope of the government
Okay.
and promotes individual liberty.
But what about the other side?
Critics worry about increased crime rates.
Especially in communities that are already struggling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they also raise concerns about a weakening of protections for vulnerable groups.
So it comes down to what we value as a society.
Yeah, individual liberty versus collective safety and well-being.
Those are tough choices.
Really tough choices.
And these are the kinds of debates that Project 2025 is all about.
It forces us to confront these fundamental questions.
About what kind of country we want to live in.
Exactly.
Okay, before we move on, I want to emphasize something important. Project 2025 has a lot of support.
It does.
From some pretty big names in the conservative movement.
Some potential presidential candidates have already said they agree with its goals.
So this isn't just some theoretical document.
No, it has real potential to become policy.
If a conservative administration wins in 2025.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be informed.
To understand what it's all about.
And to engage in these discussions.
Whether you agree with it or not.
It's a window into a possible future.
A future that could be very different from what we have now.
And that's worth paying attention to.
Exactly. And that's why we're doing this deep dive.
To give you the information you need.
And you can find more resources in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll link to the report itself.
So you can read it for yourself.
And form your own opinions.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot here.
We have. We've talked about the goals of Project 2025.
Its potential impact.
And the role of the 2024 election.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to go back to a key theme in Project 2025.
Okay, what's that?
Remember that phrase, the managerial left?
Yes. The idea that the federal bureaucracy is dominated by a certain ideology.
Right, and they want to replace these so-called career bureaucrats.
With people who share their values.
And that raises some big questions.
About who should be running the country.
What does this vision for the future tell us about their priorities?
And how does it align with your own vision for the future?
That's the question I want to leave you with as we finish up this deep dive.
It's a question worth thinking about.
Because the future of our government is shaped by the choices we make.
And those choices are more effective when we're informed.
And engaged.
Exactly.
We've spent a lot of time talking about what's in Project 2025.
Yeah, we have.
But I'm curious, what does it tell us about the mindset behind it?
Right.
This whole idea of replacing the managerial left.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about how they view the government?
I think it's really interesting, because on the one hand, it shows this distrust of the people who are working in government right now.
Like the federal employees.
The federal workforce, yeah.
Okay.
And it paints a picture of, this bureaucracy.
Right.
That's just stuck in its ways.
Doesn't want to change.
Yeah, resistant to change.
Yeah.
So they see it as a system that needs to be totally overhauled.
Not just a little tweak here and there.
Like a complete reboot.
Okay, and it's not just about efficiency though, right?
No, I think you're right.
It feels like they're saying that certain types of people should be in charge.
Yeah, like people with a certain ideology.
Exactly.
Are better suited to run the government.
Wow. Okay, so it's like a bigger debate then.
It is. It's about the role of expertise.
Versus ideology.
Exactly. Should the government be run by, career civil servants?
Right. People who've been there a long time.
Who really know the ins and outs of their field?
Yeah.
Or should it be run by people who might not have that experience?
But they have the right ideas.
But they align with the administration's ideology.
That's a big question.
It is a big question.
It's do we want the experts?
Mm-hmm.
Or do we want people with a vision?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
And I'm sure there are arguments on both sides.
There are. The people who support Project 2025 would say that fresh perspectives are important, and that having people who are committed to a certain ideology is necessary to make real change.
Like to shake things up?
Exactly. They would say that career bureaucrats are too stuck in the old ways of doing things.
Okay, so they're not open to new ideas.
Right, not open to bold new ideas.
But then couldn't you also say that experience is really important?
Of course. You could argue that experience and expertise are essential for good governance.
You need to know how things work.
Exactly.
So replacing people who've been there a long time with people who might not know what they're doing
could lead to some problems.
Yeah, like instability or even harm.
Absolutely, and it raises questions about politicization
of government agencies.
Yeah, the focus is on ideology rather than experience.
Right.
It could undermine how well those agencies function.
So it's about more than just who's in charge.
It's about their values.
Their principles.
The things that guide their decisions.
Right, and that's where it becomes really important for all of us.
Absolutely, because it comes down to what kind of government do we want?
Right.
Do we want efficiency and ideological purity?
Or do we want experience and a balance of different views?
Those are tough questions.
Really tough.
And they have real consequences.
Because these policies affect our lives.
They do. They affect everything from education to healthcare.
The environment.
The economy.
Everything.
And Project 2025 lays out one vision for what those policies might look like.
Right. Whether you agree with it or not.
You have to understand what it means
And have these conversations.
about the kind of future we want.
It's like we're at a fork in the road.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
And there are all these different paths we could take.
And Project 2025 shows us one of those paths.
But we get to decide which way to go.
We do, as citizens,
And that decision starts with understanding the choices
and the consequences,
and what's important to us.
our values.
Exactly. So as you're thinking about all of this,
Yeah.
ask yourself some tough questions.
Like what?
Like, what parts of Project 2025 do you agree with?
Okay.
What parts worry you?
What are your priorities?
What kind of future do you want?
And how does that line up with what Project 2025 is proposing?
And don't just think about it by yourself.
Talk to other people.
People who might have different views.
Have those tough conversations.
Challenge your own assumptions.
Read different sources of information.
Because that's how we figure this out.
Together,
Through dialogue and participation.
we can work towards a future that we all want.
This deep dive has given you a glimpse of one possible future.
One that could have big implications.
But remember, the future isn't set in stone.
We create it
Through our actions and our choices.
and our engagement in the process.
So stay informed
Stay engaged.
and stay curious.
From the staff of Thinking Out Loud podcast show, thanks for listening to part 1 of Project 2025. Join us as we continue the discussion. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Join us for future discussions and leave a comment.